A warm welcome to all of our new Blue Jays. Thank you for joining our webinar today. My name is Abiola, and I'm a rising senior at Hopkins. This year, I serve as one of the core team members for the orientation and first year experience. I'm very excited to be introducing today's discussion on academic freedom. Before I turn it over to our esteemed presenters this morning, I'd like to share some ground rules as well as details of what to expect. As for the format of the webinar, we'll hear from Provost Sunil Kumar, who will introduce our panelists and moderate today's Q&A discussion. You are welcome to begin submitting your questions now and throughout the session using the Q&A feature on your screen. We'll try to get through as many questions as possible today, but we may not be able to answer all of them. Please feel free to email future questions to firstyear@jhu.edu. Now I'd like to introduce Provost Kumar. Appointed in 2016, Provost Kumar serves as the Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs. As our Chief Academic Officer for Johns Hopkins, he is responsible for promoting and coordinating the university's teaching and research missions. Prior to joining Hopkins, Provost Kumar served as Dean and Professor of Operations Management at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. Provost Kumar, welcome and thank you for sponsoring this important discussion.
Thank you, Kai, for the introduction and for kicking off this morning's discussion. Before we get started, let me also encourage you to submit any questions through the Q&A tab. We'll try to get to as many as we can in the next hour and 15 minutes. I'm delighted to welcome you to this morning's discussion on academic freedom, one of the core values of Johns Hopkins, and one I hope each of you will come to cherish during your time here. I very much look forward to seeing you all on campus. Beginning college is an exciting yet daunting time, and I can imagine that it's even more unsettling for your class. I admire the perseverance and resilience you must have had the last year and a half through all the disruptions and challenges related to the pandemic to get to where you are today. In many ways, you will be freer here at Hopkins than almost anywhere else you've been, or indeed anywhere else you're likely to go. That's because there are many freedoms and nearly all of them converge on the university campus. Freedom from parental constraints, freedom to develop your own identity, freedom to worship or not, freedom of expression, and the freedom to pursue ideas wherever they may lead without undue interference. At Johns Hopkins, we value all freedoms, but academic freedom most of all. That's because without it, we could not succeed in our mission to foster independent and original research and to bring the benefits of discovery to the world. Without it, our faculty could not test new and unorthodox ideas or share knowledge with students in the world that some may find unwelcome. Academic freedom protects our professors from being persecuted for their ideas and protects our students from having their education limited by authorities who disagree. Take, for example, the Hopkins coronavirus map created by Professor Lauren Garner of Civil and Systems Engineering and her team. This map has been the authoritative source of accurate COVID data across the globe since the early days of the pandemic. It has made an invaluable contribution to creating policy and informing debate during the pandemic. Yet it was quite controversial in its early days, with some local and even national governments resenting its transparency, especially when its data contradicted their convenient but inaccurate narratives. Lauren knew that academic freedom ensured that she could continue to cast light on the most problematic regions, regardless of any pressure. The freedom of Johns Hopkins medical and public health experts to speak candidly to the university leadership, and more importantly, to leaders across the entire country, has helped propel Hopkins to be a national leader among universities in tracking and combating the virus. Now, it's important to understand what academic freedom is and what it isn't. Understanding the distinctions helps one see the responsibilities that go in hand with the freedom. First, academic freedom is the freedom to follow your nose and study whatever idea pops into your head. It is not the freedom to say whatever idea pops into your head. Academic freedom is not the same as freedom of speech. And this leads to the first responsibility inherent in academic freedom, the responsibility to hold ideas to a high standard. We are America's first research university, and research requires rigor. The ideas we share must be backed by sound evidence and argumentation. When they are not, their expression is not an exercise of academic freedom, but rather academic laziness or even ignorance. The biologist Jerry Coyne describes the distinction this way. Can a geology teacher blithely tell her students that the earth is flat? Or a European history professor that the Holocaust didn't happen? That's not academic freedom. That's dereliction of duty. Second, academic freedom is the freedom to explore any idea you like. It is not the freedom to shut down those that you don't. Indeed, the best way to advance the progress of ideas is to ensure that people whose ideas we disagree with are given a voice, provided they meet the same high standards we apply to ourselves and allow us, in turn, to subject their ideas to scrutiny. Today, we take for granted that scientists can predict an eclipse down to the minute. Centuries earlier, scientists seeking to explain the movements of the sun and the moon were convicted of heresy. Today's heresy may become tomorrow's dogma, and today's accepted wisdom may be disproved before long. To paraphrase Baltimore's unofficial philosopher, H.L. Mencken, the profoundest truths of the Middle Ages will be are now laughed at by school children. And some of what we hold to be profound truths will be laughed at a few centuries hence, even by school teachers. We have a responsibility to allow all ideas to get aired so that we can best discern the lasting truths among them. If we do not do this, we cannot live up to the university's motto, taken from the Gospel of John. Veritas vos liberavit. The truth shall set you free. To get there, we must first ask, as in the Gospel of John, quid est veritas? What is truth? From time to time, this will mean listening to ideas that we may find deeply disquieting. It is important in these moments to remember that allowing all ideas to get aired does not mean acquiescence to the content of those ideas. If anything, listening to these ideas empowers you to better interrogate their content, find flaws, give substance to your dissent. And in these moments, remember that the university is here to support you in your journey of discovery. We cannot, and indeed should not, block disquieting ideas, but we will support you when you confront them. This leads to a third critical distinction. Academic freedom gives us free rein over how we think. It does not give us free rein over how we act on our thoughts. Intimidation and harassment are unacceptable. Acts of hatred, like the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, designed to intimidate and inspire fear, have no place here at Hopkins. And we will dissent in the strongest possible terms from ideas that seek to turn our diversity into a source of strife. Let me close with a note on diversity, inclusion, and social justice. The full value of academic freedom can only be realized in a richly diverse environment. In a world of homogeneous people and thoughts, our assumptions will never be challenged, and new pathways of discovery will never be forged. It is only when different ideas mix and collide that we get the creative friction and discoveries that shed fresh light on old problems and get us closer to new truths. Among those old problems that we want to explore are our own shortcomings as an institution, particularly with respect to racial justice. Professor Martha Jones, who you will hear from shortly, is leading the Hard Histories Project, which seeks to uncover the university's history of racism and discrimination from its founding to its present day. Martha is overseeing a number of different activities to seek to engage our broadest communities at Johns Hopkins and in Baltimore in a frank an informed exploration of how racism has been produced and permitted to persist as part of our structure and practice. Academic freedom allows her and her colleagues to candidly report and discuss when we have failed as a university to uphold the principles of equality and justice, which will in turn help us learn and do better moving forward. I hope during your time here, your many conversations with your classmates and professors will inform your thinking, broaden your horizons, and inspire you to seek new intellectual frontiers. In this regard, I hope you sign up for courses that don't just reinforce your views, but challenge them. Seek to cultivate in yourself the ability to see things from many points of view. If you leave here without having your own ideas tested, you will have missed out on one of the key gifts of a university education. Now, who better to get those many conversations started than our distinguished panelists on this here today? We have Hilary Bock, Associate Professor of Philosophy and Luce Professor in Bioethics and Moral and Political Theory in the Rigor School of Arts and Sciences. Hal Branch, Henry A. Kissinger Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs at the School of Advanced International Studies. And Martha Jones, Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and Professor of History and Professor at the SNF Agora Institute. Each brings a unique perspective to the topic of academic freedom and its importance, given their unique mix of scholarship and professional experience. And therefore, I want to start the conversation with the obvious first question. What does academic freedom mean to each of our panelists? Martha, why don't I turn it over to you to start with your conception of academic freedom and what it means to you in theory and practice.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, Provost Kumar, for bringing us together. Thank you to Kai for convening us. And it's really an honor to be with you all this morning as you are launching an extraordinary year at Hopkins. Like everybody, I regret that we begin on the Zoom, but I will be back on campus next week, and I know you all will be too, and I look forward to crossing paths with you. I have learned, and I'm always learning, about the deep relevance of academic freedom in my work, in my professional life. I'm a historian of African-American life and culture and politics. I'm a historian of law, and largely my work looks at the role that Black Americans have played in the long story of American democracy. Now, take a course with me and you'll learn a great deal about the history of the field of African-American studies, which is a place where we can understand how important it has been in a broad sense for there to be the protection of dissident thinkers, of those who challenge the status quo, who ask hard questions, not only about the quotidian dimensions of our work, but about the ways in which fields like mine finally do enter into the mainstream of American academia. And I look forward to those conversations. But the hat I want to wear with you this morning is the hat I wear as the director of the Hard Histories at Hopkins project that Provost Kumar referred to. Some of you may know that December of 2020, we began an exploration, a conversation, an examination of the university's early history, the history and the life of Mr. Hopkins himself, asking those difficult questions about the role that race and racism, discrimination, and in the 19th century, slavery played in the life of Mr. Hopkins, and in some sense, the foundation of our institution. Now, there are people wearing lots of hats who are interested in this, and you can imagine our alums have a deep interest. Our prospective students, probably many of you had a deep interest in these questions. Our leadership, our administration, Provost Kumar, President Daniels, our board of trustees, our community in Baltimore. But academic freedom helped me to find my way as a researcher, as a distinct player, if you will, in a roiling debate about who we were and what our origins have been as an institution. And that means I have a distinct expertise in historical research and interpretation. I have a distinct set of skills and methodologies. And I am, in a sense, insulated from the political concerns, the affective concerns, and the other kinds of interests, the rankings concerns, and lots of other things that are on the table as we discuss something as important as institutional history. The result is the lab that I run called Hard Histories, where undergraduate researchers, along with graduate student teachers, work together archivally to independently ask questions about the early university history, including about Mr. Hopkins, but to arrive at our own conclusions, our own interpretations in consultation with other experts, in debate with one another. And I think for me, Hard Histories is really the embodiment of what academic freedom is. It's important to say we do not all agree about the evidence, about how to interpret it, and how to represent that into the broader world. But as someone who has spent many years now in an academic setting, I appreciate that's precisely what academic freedom makes possible and protects, is our ability to pursue those questions wherever they take us, to hone and develop our expertise, and then to come together, whether it's in seminar or in webinar, or in office hours, to talk through how we see the evidence and the kinds of conclusions that we want to draw. So I share this example to say academic freedom is, for me, very much alive and part of the everyday fabric of the work I do. And I feel it keenly, even as we don't always agree. What I've come to admire is precisely what Provost Kumar underscored, which is that however we come down on the questions, what we bring distinctly as a university community is the kind of expertise and rigor and commitment to a kind of truth-telling that I hope the Hard Histories Project embodies. So again, welcome to Hopkins. I look forward to seeing you all on campus.
Thank you, Martha. Appreciate that. Let me turn to Hal with the same question. What has it meant to you as a scholar? So over to you, Hal.
Thank you, Provost Kumar. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone, and I just share Professor Jones's regret that we're not able to do it in person. So by way of background, I'm a historian as well. I focus mainly on questions of U.S. foreign policy, and so how has the United States interacted with the world in the past, and how does it do so today? And those are the subjects on which I teach classes. And I say that because there is a saying that's common in my field, which I think is actually germane here. And so about 25 years ago, a Harvard professor named Joseph Nye, when he was serving in government, coined a saying, basically saying that security is like oxygen. When it's plentiful, you don't think about it at all. When it's scarce, you can think about nothing else. And for those of us in the academy, academic freedom kind of plays a similar role. I was reflecting when the provost asked me to be on this panel that I don't spend a lot of time on a day-to-day basis thinking about sort of why academic freedom is important to me, but that's because I enjoy it, working at Johns Hopkins University. And if you didn't enjoy it, you would think about little else. I think that the case for why academic freedom is important has been made quite nicely by the provost and by Professor Jones. I just add 4 brief observations about how I think about academic freedom, mostly from my own teaching. And the first is I just want to underscore the distinction that the provost made, that academic freedom is not the same thing as the freedom to exclude or shut down points of view that you happen to disagree with. And so I'll give an example. A couple of years ago, we had a speaker to campus, Michael Morell, who was formerly the deputy director of the CIA. And when he had worked at the CIA, he had been peripherally involved in the coercive interrogation program after 9/11. And in his memoir, he wrote a chapter on that subject, not defending it, but explaining why he thought it was attractive to policymakers in the post 9/11 context. And so when he came to speak at Johns Hopkins, a group of students and community members decided to come to the event and protest the event and register their displeasure with that policy and Mr. Morell's involvement with it, which was fine up to a point. It ceased to be fine when they refused to allow him to speak and to offer his perspective. And that was, I think, where it crossed the line between productive disagreement of the sort that you would want to have at an event like this and an effort to limit the freedom of expression or the academic freedom that others would have enjoyed at that event. And so that distinction is important to keep in mind. A second point, when we have discussions about academic freedom, I think it's very important to be able to distinguish between exposition and advocacy. And so explaining a given position, even a controversial position, is not necessarily the same thing as supporting it. And so I'd come back to this same example. So Michael Morell basically argued in his book that he thought torture was morally wrong and that it was counterproductive. But in order to understand the debate and in order to have an intelligent debate about the subject, you had to understand what was attractive about the use of torture after 9/11 in a counterterrorism context. And so he really went through and in a sophisticated fashion outlined why policymakers were drawn to this approach. That's actually the sort of thing you have to be able to do to debate these issues in a sophisticated way. And so that's a second point I would raise. The third point I would raise is that I think it's really difficult to learn and grow in an intellectual context unless you are able to play devil's advocate and express controversial ideas. And those ideas have to be rooted in rigorous inquiry, as both Professor Jones and Provost Sunil Kumar remarked. And so they can't simply be things that occur to you off the top of your head. But to give you an example, when I used to teach a class on ethics in foreign policy. And so we would debate issues ranging from the strategic bombing of civilian populations during World War II to the promotion of human rights in US foreign policy today. And I need in those classrooms, and students need the ability to figure out how they think about these issues by probing the boundaries of what the evidence will allow you to argue. They need to be able to take controversial opinions, defend them, see how those opinions are then critiqued, and figure out where they think the truth lies within that context. And so you need a climate that is respectful of academic freedom in order for that to happen. And then the last point I would simply make is that academic freedom is really for you. It's about your ability to grow and become stronger as a thinker. And so if you are only exposed to a climate of opinions that you already agree with, you may become a very good member of the intellectual B team, but you will not be ready to be a member of the intellectual A team unless you are constantly forced to defend positions that you happen to hold by those who hold different positions. It has to be done respectfully. It has to be done with the highest standards of intellectual rigor and evidence. But that just like in playing sports, is how we become stronger as individuals and as thinkers. And so I would argue that this is actually the most important part of the education you will get at Johns Hopkins, which is the opportunity to become smarter by engaging with viewpoints that you don't necessarily agree with. I will stop there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Hal. Thank you, Hal. Appreciate that very much. Let me turn to Hilary. Again, the same question to you, Hilary. What does academic freedom mean to you? And over to you.
Sorry, thank you. And also thank Kai for introducing us. So academic freedom means a lot to me, as probably a number of you will shortly discover. I teach bioethics, And teaching bioethics means that I teach a lot of extremely controversial topics. I teach abortion. I teach euthanasia. I teach all sorts of things that are deeply, deeply controversial all the time. And I think that it's important, whatever view you take on these topics, for everybody to have the ability to articulate their views clearly and to understand that there are arguments on the other side and how to defeat those arguments. So one reason why academic freedom is important, I think, is just that at least I have known people in the past who have not enjoyed the ability to encounter people with different views. And some of them have, it seems to me, been swayed by incredibly weak arguments the first time they encounter them. I think that if you don't want to be one of those people, you ought to hopefully encounter not just the weak, but also the strongest possible arguments against the views that you hold, so that you can figure out, on the one hand, do you want to change your mind? But if you don't, you need to figure out why exactly you don't want to change your mind, so that you are not in the position of, somebody who encounters, a contrary view for the first time and then goes, oh, wait, now I have to change my entire worldview. That's not good for anybody. Secondly, it's important because, of course, as I said, all the topics I teach are controversial. So, there have recently been, in fields that are not mine, attempts. I mean, if you think about the attempts more recently of people to try to shut down what they think of as critical race theory, which people oddly seem to think is taught in K through 12, which is rather bizarre. But I think there was a law in Iowa recently that at least tried, unsuccessfully because of courts, to make it illegal to teach that the United States is a fundamentally racist society. Now, you might think that the United States is a fundamentally racist society, or you might think that it's not. But surely, I think it's the sort of thing that whatever view you take, you ought to think, well, the other side should be debated. You ought to be able to hear those views. You certainly don't want to depend on politicians to tell you what views you can debate and what views you can't, if for no other reason than that there is absolutely no guarantee that those politicians will hold the right views. So I think that makes it very important for me. I think that I also find it very important to think about academic freedom, at least for me, as involving responsibility. So I teach topics that I'm always aware are likely to be personal for some of the people that I'm teaching. It is likely, if I take a topic like abortion, that some person in my class will have possibly been personally involved in a decision about whether or not to have an abortion, or perhaps they have friends or loved ones or siblings who have been involved in such a decision. So it seems to me that whenever I teach this, I have to bear in mind the fact that this is not for everybody just some sort of abstract debating issue. This is real. And it seems to me that it ought to be possible, and I try to make sure that it is not just possible, but actual in my classroom. You guys can decide for yourselves with what success I make this attempt, but I try really hard to, on the one hand, present arguments on both sides as clearly and forcefully as I can, while on the other hand, trying to respect the fact that this is for people, for some people, and I will of course not know who, a personal issue. And it's not something where I ought to be just trying to score cheap debating points or shut down the other side or anything like that. That, it seems to me that would just be horrible. The last thing I want to say is that I think that when I look back on my own time as an undergraduate, I was a dorky, strange person. I was given to asking all sorts of strange questions that were part of my intellectual development, but that I'm sure might have struck other people as just plain odd. I mean, I used to strike, and probably still strike, lots of people as just plain odd. It was incredibly important to me, as I look back, to think that I had the freedom to ask any question, that I should, of course, try to be a decent person and try to understand the perspectives of everybody around me, not try to be hateful, not try to be a troll, which why would anybody want to do that? I have no idea. But on the other hand, feel like I could ask any question I wanted to and work out my own strange, weird way to the views that I ended up holding. And I think if you ask yourself, what kind of freedom would you like in your effort, which hopefully won't be quite as odd as mine, but at any rate, it will be yours, idiosyncratic in the way that you are. You need to work out your own unique way towards the views that you will end up holding with respect for other people. Hopefully other people will have respect for you. But when you're trying to figure out how to respond to someone you disagree with, I think it's always worth asking yourself, could this person not be a fundamentally good person? And if they are a fundamentally good person, should you not treat them the way you would want to be treated by people who disagree with you, in a way that gives you the space to work out your own way towards your own intellectual views? So I think, to me, freedom of speech, which is not the same as academic freedom, but also academic freedom, they are ways in which we are treated as adults. We are treated as adults in that we are allowed to say all sorts of things. We are also treated as adults in that we are expected to exercise responsibility and, again, not to be trolls, not to be deliberately hateful to other people. We're expected to be basically decent people who can be appealed to by reasons. This is what academic freedom is. And I think the main reason to me why it's important is because I actually really want to be treated as an adult. And I want to treat the people around me as adults. So as you are now adults, again, I look forward to seeing all of you on campus again for the first time in ages. And I hope that you will find that the university is as good to you in terms of the freedom it affords you as it has been to me. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Hilary. Appreciate it. I'm going to ask one more set of questions for each of the panelists. And in the meantime, please do send in your questions through the Q&A tab. The question I want to ask is about operationalizing academic freedom within the classroom. So a common question we get is, if I disagree with my instructor or take a contrary position to where the instructor seems to be going, would I get penalized in grading, for example? Would my essay be penalized if I took a controversial view? So that's one. The other is also on limits within the classroom. When does, reasoned debate stray beyond acceptable limits in your classroom? And so talk a little bit about what it means within your classroom. And maybe, again, I'll turn to Martha first and then do the other two panelists as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's a great question and an important one. I want to give an example of how far I think the proposition, right, that disagreement in the classroom, even disagreement with the professor, is at the core of what we do. A couple of years back now, and I think Kai might have been among these students, I was writing a book, and I used the draft chapters of the book as one reading for our seminar. And there I was inviting students deliberately to disagree with me, to challenge me, to debate with me, and so that my ideas would improve, but our collective understanding of the subject. And I was writing a book about the history of African-American women in voting rights at that time. So here, even in my own research, I think it's essential in my process to get to my goals, to get to the best book I can write, to be in debate with students who are reading, doing their own independent research, and bringing their own thinking to the material. So I think this is critical. But you're right, I think, Provost Kumar, to remind us that certainly as an instructor, I am responsible for a learning environment that is not only driven by debates around ideas, but is also framed by respect, by the dignity of everyone who is part of the learning experience, And so we talk about those things also, and we recognize that they stand alongside the intensity of an academic freedom style debate, that we're also each charged with maintaining a learning environment that keeps us all in the room, that maintains the dignity of everybody who is part of the conversation. And so in my classroom, we talk about that too. What are the ground rules for a discussion, right? What are the kinds of norms that frame our debates? And I think with that, we are able to wed the two and get to the goal, which is the excellence in the research, without sacrificing those other values.
Thank you for that. Hal, your thoughts?
Sure. So one of the nice things about coming to a place like Hopkins is you will find that many of your professors are active participants in the major scholarly or the major policy debates in their fields, and that's cool. What it means, though, is that oftentimes their readings, right, their articles and books will show up on your syllabus, and that can be an important teaching tool. But what I don't want you to take away from that is that the expectation in my class, or frankly in anybody else's class, is that you're being asked to mimic or agree with that perspective. What I often tell my students, particularly when they write papers, if citing my own article back to me or something like that, is I know what I think, right? I don't need to be told what I think. I want to know what you think and how you got there. And frankly, I will have a lot of respect for someone who takes a position that is contrary to what I think or what you think I think, and can defend it in a rigorous way. I think that's wonderful. I actively encourage it in my classes. And one of the ways I will do that is frequently by taking the exact opposite position of what I actually believe in class and arguing that very wholesomely as a way of generating debate and creating space for debate. And so I think that actually will be one of the most interesting and neat things you find about Hopkins, which is that you're gonna interact with a lot of professors who want you to challenge the prevailing orthodoxy, so long as you can do it in an interesting way. And you should expect to be pushed on that. And so if you offer up a controversial opinion, you should expect the next question to be, well, why do you think that? Why do you think that position A is wrong and position B is correct? To demonstrate that there's something beyond just sort of being contrarian in your perspective. But that's exactly the sort of discussion that a seminar or any sort of intellectual climate thrives on. And so I think that's something that you'll find encouraged. With respect to the question of when you cross the boundaries, that's sort of a tricky question. And there's a lot of different ways to answer that. The one I would just point out is that style can be as important as substance in that respect. And so the manner in which an opinion is presented can be as important as the opinion itself. And so just to reiterate something that Professor Jones said, I have a huge amount of tolerance for out-of-the-box ideas, so long as they are presented, A, in a respectful manner, and B, so long as they seem to draw on some degree of rigorous argumentation and evidence. And so the boundaries of freedom of expression in my classroom are actually quite wide, so long as those two conditions are met.
Thank you. Before I turn to Hilary, I want to emphasize what both Martha and you have said, which is the need for a standard here. The why becomes the standard. You got to be able to, it's perfectly fine for you to disagree with your professor, but that disagreement better have some reasoning, some evidence, something behind it that suggests you've thought about it, right? So standards also matter here. So thank you for that. Hilary, over to you. In your classroom, how is this operationalized, disagreeing with you, etc.? So go ahead.
So I try to operationalize it by, first of all, trying as hard as I can to evaluate students simply on the basis of the arguments that they make. I do not in any way expect my students to agree with me. I go to some lengths to try to make sure that none of my TAs do that either. But personally, I think, it's like one of my nightmares that instead of being surrounded by a bunch of students who are presenting their own points of view, which are generally interesting, I'm surrounded by a bunch of students who are trying to figure out what they think I think, and then trying to pretend to be a person who agrees with everything they think I think. They're often wrong about what I think, because sometimes I play devil's advocate as well. But moreover, you never do as good a job pretending to be somebody else as you do being yourself. And if you are yourself, you're likely to have a bunch of ideas that are genuinely interesting. If you try to pretend to be the person you think I want you to be, where that means agreeing with the ideas that you think that I have, it's going to be incredibly boring. And so in addition to being intellectually committed to the free exchange of ideas and intellectually committed to fostering an environment in which I respect people who disagree with me, I also vastly prefer, as a matter of just my personal preference, having people who robustly challenge me. I mean, I got into this business because I like having arguments, so long as those arguments are respectful. And, I like doing that, and I would like you to do that to me. About the limits, I think the basic limit is just, are you treating people with respect? I think it's very hard to draw out some set of rules that would actually delineate what counts as respectful and what doesn't. And the best way I think I can get this across is by a short story. And the short story is, once I was listening to talk radio and I heard this person inveighing against what he'd found a 28-page list of specifications of what counts as a toothpick. And he was like, only the federal government would take 28 pages to define a toothpick. And I thought, no, I know how this happened. Back in George Washington's day, they sent someone to get toothpicks, but then somebody had the clever idea of sending everybody to his brother-in-law's store to get the toothpicks. And then they said, oh, we have to have competitive bidding. And they said, okay, what is a toothpick? And they made some definition, but somebody said, why not sawdust? Why not? It's pieces of wood after all. Why not little shavings that you've sort of planed off something? And I thought, you just push one boundary after another and you end up with a 28-page document attempting to specify what a toothpick is. Now, if we imagine doing the same thing here with all the students trying to push all the boundaries and go, well, exactly, does this cross the line? Does that cross the line? Is this disrespectful? What about that? We're going to end up with some long, horrible, ghastly document attempting to spell out something we should all recognize, just like we should all recognize, how do you buy a toothpick? And we should hope not to try to press those boundaries. I think I want to have a broad tolerance for students who are genuinely asking questions, but I recognize that it's going to be much more difficult to have that broad tolerance if all of my students are like, I'm just going to see exactly how much disrespect I can get away with before she brings the hammer down. I don't want to bring the hammer down on anybody. But moreover, I don't want to have to try to define what respect is. I wish that everybody felt as free as they possibly could while fully accepting the responsibility of trying to get along decently with their fellow students. I myself have a thick skin. I've cultivated it at length. It's the students that I worry about.
Thank you. And so there have been several questions here, so I want to do two of them quickly. One of which is, should you reach out to professors if you have interesting ideas? Absolutely, right? So that's absolutely. Now, I think faculty, at least I do, like hearing from students who have interesting ideas. I don't like it when they call me names, but short of that, it's good. I'm kidding. They write, and it's I think important to reach out to faculty. I think people on this panel would have no doubt engaged deeply with not only students in their class, but other students more broadly as well, right? So. And so that's the first one. The second question I will throw out to the panel. It's a very good one, which is, being surrounded by superb scholars in JHU can be intimidating. How how do we make sure we are not swayed by weak arguments presented by people who seem more knowledgeable than us? This is a very good, very good question. So I'll just ask any of the panelists who wish to speak to it.
I could jump in if I could, because I think what I'd say is that my first reaction to that question is to remember that what we know and how we know it, it develops over time and changes over time. That I don't think the test of an idea can be contained or resolved in a seminar session, maybe not even in a semester. And so I think part of what you see embodied in the work lives of your faculty are people who have been chewing on the same questions for a very long time, or similar questions, related questions. And so I guess part of what I would urge, right, is that no encounter, no moment, right, is the measure of what I know or what you know. That part of what is infinitely fascinating about what we do in the university is that our capacity to know and what we know is developing all the time. And I think part of the strength, right, that academic freedom gives us, right, is to arrive at that moment to say, you know, once upon a time, I thought this, and this is why I thought it. But now, in my case, I've spent more time in the archives, and I think something else. And I think we have to leave room for that, rather than imagining that what this is sort of getting it right or getting it wrong, or because I don't think that's, for me at least, that's not really the goal.
I might just add one thing. The question reminds me of a recent New Yorker cartoon where a man and a woman are sitting across a table from each other, and the man says, allow me to interrupt your expertise with my confidence. And that is a dynamic that I think we're all familiar with, and it can be intimidating. I would just say that when I cover a certain subject in the readings for a week of a class on the future of US foreign policy, what I typically will do is provide paired readings that provide two different perspectives on a given subject. And the reason for that is that way everyone who has done the readings comes in with enough empirical background and enough analytical background so that they can make an argument and challenge an argument made from the other side. And what that does is it decreases the ability to simply make assertions on the basis of confidence, because everyone in the room who has done the reading will have the ability to at least question that judgment based on some other analytical premise or some other source. And so this is a plug for, doing the reading. But the second point I would make, and this builds on Martha's point, is that you should think of a class or a course meeting or whatever the discussion is as an invitation to learn more, right? And so there are, the amount of work you can do in preparation for a single seminar meeting barely scratches the surface of the amount you can learn about a particular subject. And so if you find that you are in this situation, the best way of addressing it is simply by learning more about the subject that interests you, because that will, frankly, leave you less susceptible to being, intimidated by the confidence with which somebody else expresses their viewpoint.
Yeah, I think I would just add that the best way, well, first of all, I think it's worth bearing in mind the possibility of being swayed by weak arguments, because I would hope that each of you thinks of yourself as a basically good person. And if you think a basically good person, such as yourself, might momentarily be swayed by an argument for a conclusion that was wrong, then you might think, when you find somebody that you disagree with, even about something that seems fundamental, maybe this is a good person who has also been swayed by an argument, that they shouldn't have been swayed by. And maybe if I come up to them with respect, rather than say dragging them on social media, that will actually help them to get back to wherever it is that they should get back to. Or maybe on the other hand, if I try to engage them, I'll find that they have been swayed by a strong argument, which actually sways me as well. But I think in general, the way to get better at not being swayed by weak arguments is just to get better at arguing. And the way you get better at arguing is by actually doing it. It's like the way you get better at most things, it's practice, which is yet another reason why academic freedom is so important. If nobody felt that they could actually argue about anything, or that they could advance thoughts that they had that they weren't sure whether they were right, but they seemed worth thinking about at least for a moment, then nobody would ever have any arguments. But then again, nobody would ever be good at arguments. I mean, it would be like thinking that the most important thing in life was to be a really good baseball player, but forbid anybody ever actually to play baseball, right? That would be a silly way to proceed. And so, we argue about everything. We assume that many of the people that we disagree with, not, I don't know, actual Nazis, but, the people we disagree with are probably people we disagree with in good faith. And we try to change their minds and allow them to change ours.
Thank you. And so let me add a personal thing here. And, I have a incredibly privileged job because I get to interact with people from, 8 different schools, wide variety of expertise. And the only thing I'm certain of is, except for one little corner of operations research, they all know a lot more than I do about whatever it is we are talking about, because I usually talk to them about their expertise. They, for some reason, are less interested in mine. And I'm, again, and so if you talk to faculty about their expertise, you will ask dumb questions, because what is settled dogma in their field is new to you. And the whole point here is to take advantage of the more knowledgeable people to expand my horizons and your horizons. This is not about us saying, oh, I shouldn't look bad in front of them, right? I have no problem. For example, it was a revelation in the Hard Histories project on how hard it is to get evidence, right? Martha used a phrase, in my world, you look through the world through shards of glass. Well, I'm an applied mathematician. Everything is precisely written out through, you write down a set of axioms, and then everything else follows from those, right? There is zero ambiguity in the argumentation, whereas this is not how Martha's field works. And I learned a great deal by not only being ignorant, but by being willing to expose that ignorance to learn, right? So do not ever think that somehow you will look bad because you asked what you thought was a naive question, right? I have no problem asking naive questions. I do them all the time. And the reason is, hey, that's one of the perks of my job, that I get to learn from people like the people on this panel. And so I think you would shortchange yourself if you let somebody else's perceived confidence or even knowledge intimidate you from asking what seems like the naive question, right? So the other question is also a good question, which perhaps I will answer, which is, can we expect the same degree of fearless inquiry and rigor in classes taught by non-tenured professors? And the answer is yes. When Lauren put out her map, for example, which I talked about in my remarks, she was not tenured. The tenure's got nothing to do with this, right? This is a inbuilt value where every member of our community gets to put forward, in her case, data that governments did not find convenient for their narratives. Because they kept saying India was an example of a country where there was a lot of local skepticism when we said, our predictions are saying that things are not going to look good in a little bit of time. And the people making those predictions were not tenured. And the university this has got nothing to do with tenure. And so let me turn back to our panelists with one other question, which is, when you have a how does the idea of academic freedom intersect with the fact that we get people from different countries and cultures? And they may come with inherent points of view, inherent biases. We all have them. I have my own. And so given these, how do you incorporate those? Because and I guess the implicit question here is, it's not possible to always dissociate the idea from the person who's espousing the idea. And so how do you do this is the question. So I'll turn it back to the panel on this.
I guess I would respond to that under the frame of comparative thinking. And in my field, in history, comparative thinking across time, across space, across culture, and more is an essential component of what we do. It's that comparative thinking, I think, that sharpens our sense of our subject matter if we happen to be, for example, studying US history. So here, I mentioned having teaching the history of African-American women in voting rights the last few years while I was finishing a book. This year, I've been spending my time. Last week I was in Hong Kong, and next week I'm in Sweden, later this week. Okay, it's all virtual, I confess, but it's to say I'm intentionally putting myself in that comparative setting so that I can share my thinking, but also I can sharpen my thinking and create an important context for my thinking that is comparative. So I guess I think in my classroom, those differences are strengths, and they enrich our inquiry. And I at least want to make room for them as we can in order to enhance what we do.
Just to wholeheartedly agree with that. I think that differing perspectives, whether they come from different cultural backgrounds or any other source, are a source of strength. And so how you think about, if you, let's say you have someone from Guatemala in a class on US foreign policy, that person may have a different perspective on US foreign policy during the Cold War than someone who comes from the United Kingdom or Japan. If you have a student from China in your class, that person may have a different perspective on the sources of tension in the US-Chinese relationship than someone who comes from the United States or Germany or any other country. And so if what we're trying to do here is sort of get at the pursuit of truth, then having different perspective is actually something that will make us intellectually stronger and better rounded in doing that. The caveat, of course, and it's an important one, is that everyone should expect to have their premises and their analysis challenged. And so at the beginning of every course that I teach, the first day of class, I walk in and will ask someone a hopelessly broad question about the subject at hand, and then ask that unlucky person to defend their answer on it for the next 5 to 10 minutes. And I admit it's a little bit of an uncomfortable thing to do on the first day of class, but the point is exactly this, that I don't just want to know what you think, I want to know why you think it and how you arrive at that conclusion, because forcing students to think through that is a way of sort of encouraging the formation of the standards and the rigor that we've talked about as really being the foundation of academic freedom. And so that's something that goes for perspectives that come from different cultural backgrounds or different national backgrounds or whatever it may be.
Yeah, I would just like to echo, sorry, am I on? I don't know.
You're good, you're good.
Okay, so I would just like to echo what everybody else has said. The fact that we have different perspectives puts us in a much stronger position when it comes to challenging our own. And I think we should all want for those parts of our perspective that are strongly defensible to be strongly defended by us and for us to know what those defenses are. But for those parts of our own perspectives that on reflection we have very little to be said for them to be exposed. And it seems to me that so long as you do this in a manner that is respectful of other people's identity, if you are doing the challenging, in just the way that you would want people to be respectful of your identity, then I think it's only a good thing to become, at any rate, more aware of biases that you might not have been aware of before. And so I think, it's a strength from basically every point of view.
Thank you. The other question, this comes to the limits, which is how do you handle arguments or ideas that are potentially harmful to others? I'll open that up to the panel.
I'll jump in if you want.
Sure, go ahead, Hilary.
Yeah, so I, of course, deal with a lot of ideas that are potentially harmful to others. Again, not harmful in the sense of disrespecting anyone's specific identity. That's normally not what I deal with. But again, when I teach abortion, I assume that at least some people in my classroom have probably, they or someone they love have been involved in a decision about this topic. When I talk about end-of-life care, I assume that, my students may have grandparents, hopefully not parents yet, but grandparents who have faced those kinds of decisions. And if somebody asks a question implying that what they did might have been wrong, that might be harmful to that student. I think that in general, it's a good idea to be able, at least to some degree, and in some cases, to detach the question, what are the arguments for this view, from a personal attack? So that you can think, perhaps I was wrong about this, without thinking something like, then I must be a horrible person. Because if you think about it, people are wrong about things all the time. They're even wrong about large moral questions all the time. And it can't be that all of them are wrong only because they are horrible people. So I think I want to create a classroom that is respectful, where people know that these are hard issues. If you yourself have made the wrong call, or if people you love have made the wrong call at some point in the past, that may be a tough thing to realize. But in part because in my class, it's not possible to teach the course material that I teach without suggesting that some people in my class might have been, I don't suggest anything about this, but the readings, which take various different positions, have to suggest that all sorts of people have been wrong about something in the past. It is absolutely essential to be able to distinguish appreciating the arguments for and against various different views on these topics from attacks on you personally, which in general they are not.
I would just add, I think the way I try to think about this is the argument being made in good faith and in accordance with standards or not, right? And so the challenge is that it's really difficult to say, okay, this set of ideas and debates is not harmful and this one is, because harm is a subjective issue, even if there are certain ideas that we might all agree are harmful. And every public policy question has an ethical dimension, because many public policy questions involve the allocation of goods and bads, or help and harm to various segments of the population. Abortion is a classic example of this. Immigration is another example of this. And there are positions within those debates that I consider to be within the bounds of acceptable discourse that some people could interpret as being harmful to particular groups, depending on what your priors are. And so what I'm looking for in classroom discussions is people who are making sharp arguments in good faith because they are trying to get at something important in a public policy debate or in an intellectual debate, and are doing so on the basis of something other than just, this is how I feel, right? They have to be doing it on the basis of evidence, on the basis of some ethical standard that they can produce. And as long as that is the case, I would consider that for the most part to be a good faith argument.
I think I would add that my idea about my role in a classroom setting, in a seminar setting, in a discussion with students, is in many ways that the buck stops with me, which is to say, I am responsible for the climate in my classroom. I am responsible for maintaining that atmosphere that is infused with respect, that extends to everyone dignity. And sometimes that means, if you will, coming off the syllabus, right? That my role sometimes is to slow the discussion down, is to introduce expressly, right, what's happening in the room. I have been known, I hope without too many complaints, right, to assign additional readings to extend a discussion. So it's to say that it's not that we can prevent moments in which those values that we hope will guide a classroom. We know that there are going to be moments when those are going to be challenged. And my sense is that our roles are not the same. That's me. And that I am responsible. I charge you all, right, with doing your part. But if things begin to go off the rails, it's me. And I need to have a toolkit, right, that I pull on, right, to bring us back to the topic, to explore difficult, hurtful, even ugly ideas. I teach the history of Black Americans. I can't teach what I teach without asking us all to confront some very difficult facets of our history. Can't teach Black Americans in my political and legal history without confronting anti-Black racism and violence. But my job is to do that and help us do that within a set of bounds that keeps everyone in the room, literally, but also keeps everyone in the discussion. And while I won't speak for everyone, it is very important, right? If even you're not able to say that to me in the open classroom, because sometimes things happen and we're just sort of unable, right, to find the words. That even happens to me. But that's what office hours are for, is for us to have a conversation one-on-one about what's happened and how we might restore the kind of trust that we need in order to have an ongoing productive conversation.
Thank you. One question that just came in, and then we should wrap up, which is the statement, "I don't know." When is it appropriate to say "I don't know" to a question? When is it not? And this is actually for me an important one, because as I said earlier, I profess ignorance and learn a lot from that professed ignorance. So, but that said, that's not an appropriate answer all the time in a classroom. So perhaps one of you could take that up.
I'll just briefly answer. I mean, I often tell my students at the beginning of the semester two things that relate to this subject. And so the first is that if you don't know, ask the question, because one, if you don't know, I guarantee other people don't know. And so you'll be doing a public service by asking the question. But two, asking, saying "I don't know," well, the answer then is, okay, how would you answer it, right? How would you figure out the answer to that? What analytical framework would you need to bring to bear? What empirical evidence would you want to bring to bear, right? And so just a quick example, one of the debates that we sometimes have in my US foreign policy class is, why did the United States choose to use atomic weapons against Japan in 1945? Was it to end World War II as quickly as possible? Was it to intimidate the Soviet Union? Was it for revenge for Pearl Harbor? Was it some other thing? And we come into class and the students, having not studied this, don't have the background to answer it initially. And so one of the exercises we go through is saying, okay, how would you answer this question, right? What would you look for and how would you know when you found the answer? And that in itself can be a very useful intellectual exercise, because it forces us to kind of problematize how we learn things, which is really getting at the heart of what we're doing.
Yeah, if I can add to that in the interest of time, I want to give people a chance to wrap up, but I don't know, because you've tried and have hit a dead end and would like to learn more, or because the material is genuinely new to you, is fine. I don't know, because you didn't do the work, is not, right? So, that is when something is assigned to you, at least the material that's assigned to you, you should know. And so that's the distinction I would make. With that, let me turn to our panelists for their final thoughts. So, if I may quote Tennyson, bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. And we have people who are 17 and 18 years old who are going to have the best 4 years of their life. And what advice do you have for them as they begin this? I'm just envious. If I'd given a chance to do this all over again, I would jump at it. And so what advice do you have for them? Martha, over to you.
I guess the first thing I'd say in light of this discussion is to be curious, to be brave, and to be open, because where you are today is certainly not where you'll be in 4 years. That's our job. But how you get from here to there is really up to you. And so I hope that, I know the pressures on you are real, and there will be academic demands on you that in some days will feel heavy. But to lose the chance to be curious, to play, to explore, to try the unknown, I think would be a missed opportunity. So I love to see engineers in my history classes, and more, because in that sense, all are welcome. And I really hope for the chance to see many of you very soon.
Thank you. Hilary, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think I would echo her advice, and I would also say, yeah, be brave, be kind. Remember those moments when you don't know what the answer to some question is, or when you've changed your mind, and imagine that the people around you are going through something like the same thing. Never be a troll, never be the sort of person who forces us to actually specify what the boundaries are, because frankly, we'd rather everybody just be arguing in good faith. But really, there are so many wonderful things that you might be curious about, and so many arguments that you might make. Take as many different kinds of courses as you possibly can. Be a kid in a candy store. Do things that you love all the time, because you learn more when you really love what you're doing. And have a wonderful, wonderful time.
Al?
Just very briefly, two things. One, learn from your peers as well as from the faculty. You'll learn as much from the people that you're taking classes with, whether it's in those classes or outside of the classes, as you will from your professors, and keep that in mind. Second, you won't spend your entire lives in climates unless you go on to become a professor, right? So if you actually work for a living, you won't spend your entire life in a climate that prizes freedom of expression and freedom of inquiry, which I think is really what we're talking about here. For the next 4 years, you will. So take advantage of it.
So let me add my own congratulations to all of you for coming to Hopkins, and I wish you the best 4 years of your life. Take advantage of every open door. There was a question, should you audit KSAS? Well, go ask the instructor. Always knock on doors, right? More of them will open than you think. And so don't hesitate to be curious, to explore, to take advantage of everything Hopkins has to offer. And finally, I'll leave you with one thing. If your goal in life has not changed even a little bit after 4 years, you got to stop and ask, did I get the full advantage of a Hopkins education, right? I know some of you have come here with very well-defined goals, and it's perfectly fine for you to have the same goals going out. But in the interim, you must ask yourself, did I do everything I can to shake myself loose of those goals? Because this is one where, you should set new aspirations for having access to an institution like Hopkins. So I wish you the very best on behalf of the panelists. learn a lot, have fun, and I look forward to seeing you all in person soon. So thank you again.